Good morning. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral, and we have an unforeseen event this morning, and that is the marathon that's happening in San Francisco, which was really easy for me to just slice right through on my bicycle, but the police did not let through a single car on Van Ness. So there may be more of us joining us as the morning unfolds, as they get through the traffic. But everybody I see here, most of you are really close to the cathedral. So thank you for being here. We're so blessed today to have Susan Stryker. I have a little introduction that I had written for her, but I didn't bring the introduction. And I've never forgotten that before. But Dr. Stryker is an expert in gender studies and really a pioneer of the transgender studies movement. So she has an incredible wisdom and historical basis. Her book is Transgender History, and she has just written the revised chapters that this was published in 2008, and she just was written the chapter that gets us up to the current day. And I was just telling her I can't wait to read that. So welcome to Dr. Susan Stryker.
Thank you. Really glad to be here. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, I was so worried about you in particular because you're the one person who had to be here. We could get by without everybody else.
It was easy.
Yeah, I'm glad that you took the roundabout way. That definitely. You know, in your first published article, there's a little, like a sentence in there that says, gosh, how did this kid growing up in Oklahoma get to be this person that I am today? And I just loved that. It was just like, I think all of us have that feeling of just, wow, I just couldn't have expected how our life turned out to unfold. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what you were like as a child and you know, how that connects to the academic work and the important historical work that you've done since then.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, that first article you mentioned, it was called "My Words to Victor Frankenstein Above the Village of Chamonix," and it uses this moment in Mary Shelley's novel where the monster talks back to the power that creates it, and basically says, "It's like I am my own thing. I'm not just what you made me. It's like I am myself." And I love the epigraph to that novel. You know. Frankenstein, where Mary Shelley quotes Milton, and the line is like, "Did I request the maker to mold me, man?" And it's like, and it's just like, no, it's just like I didn't ask. It's like, here I am, thrown into being.
Right.
And it's like, and so there was this feeling that I was trying to convey in that article about like really just sort of like claiming your own embodiment, your own way of being in the world, and saying like, however I came into being, it's like, this is it. Like whatever makes being, whatever the reason is, it's like, this is what came out of the process.
Right.
And I just accept that, even if it seems monstrous to other people, and there's actually a power in that monstrosity. Like monstrosity is about breaking form open somehow. And like that sense of there's like a kind of ecstasy in it, I would say, like a joyousness.
I never even thought about what makes monster, but yeah, I mean, it's something that's different than our ordinary experience is what makes it stand out, and it catches our attention.
Yeah, and there's actually, I mean, I'll answer your childhood question.
Yeah, later.
I will, but my academic work that I did my PhD in U.S. history at Berkeley, and I actually wrote on the history of early Mormonism.
Oh, interesting.
And that it was about
a gathering of the nations. Is that what Wallace Stegner's book is?
Yeah, but it's like for me, it was about the historicity of identity.
Right.
That question that you started with is like, how did I come to be? Like in all of my particularities. And so I was looking at the history of early Mormonism as a way to ask that question of like, 1825, there's no such thing as a Mormon. 1845, it's like they've got a church, they've got a cosmology, they've got a scripture, they've got a transcontinental migration, they've got new forms of kinship. It's like, how does all of that happen? How does identity emerge? And so I look at the same issues around, questions about sexuality and gender identities. So I look at that same question about transsexuality. It's like, what does it mean to feel transgender before there's hormones and surgery and name change documents? It's like, how does this identity emerge? But because of my training in history of religion, in that first trans studies article, it's like there's both like consciously and unconsciously a lot of religious language in there.
Right.
And that, I write some...
Well, even this, I mean, talk about, you said thrownness is like
Thrownness,
a Martin
like a
Heidegger,
Heideggerian,
Geworfenheit. I
right.
mean, it's totally, that's religious language. Like, how do you get something from nothing?
Yeah, it's about emergence. It's about what manifests into being and this sort of cosmic capacity for a kind of becoming. But in that article, I write about what does monster mean, and the word, it comes from Latin monere, which means to show, right? And so like a monstrum is like
exactly,
like demonstrates, right?
Exactly.
And so the monster is a warning. It's basically saying, I'm demonstrating something. This is showing something, And so if you look to see what the monster shows, then you see something that you weren't expecting. And so like that was, my take on the transsexual qua monster. Just look at what it's actually saying. Right. Look at what we manifest, not what your fear of the monster is.
Well, I mean, I learned so much in reading your book. I mean, it totally expanded my consciousness and mind. I mean, and maybe it's just because it's an area I don't know very much about, but it really, really changed how I saw things. And
my work is done. I can go now, right? Okay.
One of the things that I thought was so powerful was, there's so many words, and it's one of the things that you do, and I don't even think you intend to do it, is it's almost like human beings are kind of almost like a matrix of qualities, right? And that's what helped me the most. So on the one hand, you have your sexual your sex as you're born, and then you have your gender identity, where you feel comfortable in the world, and what your heart is telling you that you are, and then you have the sexual desire part too, and you can be in each of those different boxes in a different way. And that's what really, and I thought, oh my gosh, there's so many more boxes. I mean, that's my little world. Your box, your matrix may have like 20 different categories.
Maybe my dots are a little more spread out,
Yeah, exactly.
Than usual. Yeah.
That's right, exactly.
But it's a way that it can come out,
And part of it too is it just in the same way that you said it shows you something, it does show you something about human life and society and how, what it is that we're trying to be as human beings. And so I really, really appreciate it. And so many historic and really heroic figures too, people who felt like they could, march to the beat of their own drummer and found similar people too.
Yeah, no, so thank you for saying that. So to get back to your question,
exactly.
It's like, I do feel at some level my whole career is a kind of navel-gazing. It is kind of like, it's like, how is it that a creature such as me comes into existence? It's like, historians can say well, I can't tell you what it means, but I can tell you how it happened.
Right, exactly.
You'll have to argue about what it means. But, from early childhood, I felt transgendered. It's just like I didn't feel like I was assigned male at birth. My, body seemed to be a typical male body. I was raised as a boy. And from my earliest memories, it's like that was never how I felt about myself.
Right.
And it was around age 5, that it's like I sort of realized the significance of, biological bodily difference. And it's like, just like I feel this way about myself. I see how, my culture understands the meaning of your body. It's just like, how can I feel the way that I feel? Like, what does it mean? Is there something that I can do? Am I wrong? Is it a mistake? Is it like what? Like, how do I, what do I do?
Yeah, exactly.
So there was that question in me really, really early.
Well, I know that stage too of kids where they start to being very aware of, is this a boy thing or a girl thing? And I can completely imagine just, puzzling over those kinds of questions.
Yeah. So, I would say I'm not just a trans person, but my transness is something that's really intrinsic to me and has been present all along. And from very early in my childhood, it made me a questioning person.
Yeah.
It was, and there was always this sort of like checking in with like, well, I'm like this, but, the world says that. And, how can this be? Or, well, basically, what is to be done? It's the political question, right? And initially, I was all my growing up years, I really thought I was going to go into medical research. I never wanted to be anything other than a doctor.
Right.
Not necessarily working with patients, but doing medical research. I was very interested in genetics.
Wow.
And I think that's because the culturally dominant form of knowledge is science. It's like you want to get to the root of something. Like, what does science tell us?
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I got to college and was a zoology major pre-med, and I was hating my science classes and being exposed to humanities, really, for the first time. It's like, oh, I've been asking the wrong question. It's like, I've been asking how do bodies work, but what I'm really interested in is what do bodies mean? Right? It's like, that's a philosophical question.
That's great.
And so it totally reoriented my research, But I've always just been really rooted in a curiosity about myself. I have found a way to be curious about the world.
Right, exactly. One of the things I kept thinking about as I was reading the book is just the demographics of the whole thing. And I know that it's hard to have accurate statistics, and there's probably ways that the statistics are right or wrong. But I wonder if you can talk just a little bit about what you know in terms of, just what proportion of people are trans men versus trans women. How many people are we talking about when we're talking about
I can't tell you anything about the relative proportion of, trans men to trans women to non-binary people to gender non-conforming people. I don't know those figures. But over the last few years, there has been a pretty concerted effort to try to get some more quantitative data. And the most conservative estimates, which by conservative meaning they can actually figure out, looking at some large, population-based studies, the number of people who are identified as something at birth and identify as something else later. So kind of like, I used to be an X and now I'm a Y, or I used to be a Y and now I'm an X. It's like they can count that, in a lot of big sample size surveys.
Yeah.
It looks like 1.5 million people, about 0.5% of the US population. So 0.5% of the population is the most conventional kind of used to be an X, now I'm a Y trans person.
Interesting.
But then if you want to include, people who are...
I knew it was going to be complicated.
No, people who are not just,
exactly.
making a, kind of a pretty straightforward transition from team A to team B, or vice versa. People who are resisting gender categorization somehow, or people who say, well, I don't want to medically change my body, but I identify as this, or whatever. It's like, that's going to,
increase the
that
number.
might be as high as like 7 or 8% of the population, which sounds shockingly high, but that's what the science is telling us. The other thing to mention is that those figures are really for people who are adults now. And if you look at
just the way my children talk about it.
You
is
look.
so
there
different.
is this. It's like we talk about climate change. There's like gender climate change going on, where younger people are thinking about their identity in relationship to their body, in relationship to social roles and identity.
Know how to, maybe responding to it in a very different way too.
Yeah, it looks
in ways you're thinking about best practice. I mean, that's what one of the things I liked about the book too is like, what is the best practice for somebody who's on this path? As a parent, what's the best practice for the person? What's the best practice for people in the medical world? I mean, and we're still really trying to figure that out.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, so just the final point, it looks like the rates of trans or gender nonconforming identity in youth under age 18 is about 1.5 to 1.7%, like 3 times higher than the adult rate.
Wow.
So, I really feel like how we understand gender is this kind of like bubbling soup where the ground is not stable at all, and we're watching new new ways of forming a sense of self, come into being. It feels very exciting. It's like peering into the volcano and saying it's all lava bubbling up, and we don't know what that lava is going to look like when it cools.
And like I said, I mean, I think you do learn a lot from being exposed to something that's different. That's the 1% of whatever it is that you're studying. That has a lot to tell you about the 98% or that's the rest.
Yeah.
One of the statistics that I wanted to know more about, if you know anything about it, is just violence against trans people. I know that it's a terrible, terrible problem, and I just didn't know if you had any way for us to gauge the scope of that.
Yeah, well, the statistic that just is like deeply in my heart and often at the forefront of my consciousness is that in the two largest surveys of trans population in the United States, one from 2009 and one done just last year, this one statistic held constant over that 10-year period when there's been so much progress on trans issues, and that is the rate of attempted suicide among transgender people. So the attempted suicide rate nationally is about 4% of the population. The attempted suicide rate among trans people is about 40%.
That's just terrible. Yeah.
Okay? And so almost half of all trans people have tried to kill themselves. And that I really see that as, it's a manifestation of the violence that gets directed against us. Violence doesn't have to be, somebody abducting you on the street and strangling you and leaving your body in an alley. It's it's that constant level of wearing you down because the way you understand your gender is not the mainstream way of doing it. All the stigma that gets directed at you, just the pettiness of how do you deal with the DMV? How do you deal with Social Security?
Well, and as you said, I mean, your book, you're talking about what 9/11 meant for trans people, and it meant your documents matter a lot more.
Yeah.
And and all of a sudden, all those questions about which little box are you going to check and how do you get your name changed you did a great job of I mean, because I know it's an objective history and all, but it did show all the those kinds of challenges that trans people
and they're not
face.
necessarily the challenges that you think of. It's not necessarily the bigot screaming at you and wanting to beat you up. It's it's the kind of mundane, bureaucratic and administrative violence. It's about misgendering and pronouns. It's about the people thinking you're crazy, bad, sick, wrong, whatever, all the time. And it's there's a cumulative effect that just does wear people down.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that. I mean, the conversation that we're having now about transgendered bathrooms is just really hard for me to understand. I mean, as far as I can understand, there aren't recorded incidents of violence happening in women's bathrooms, and so I don't understand what the fear is behind it. And do you know? Can you say anything about that? About where is that coming from? Is am I just thinking that it's about fear when really it's about some other social agenda?
Well, I do think a lot of it is fear because public toilets are it's this really volatile interface between some of the most intimate aspects of our bodily functions and some of the things that we're most private about or that are most socially stigmatized. It's about, defecation and, urination and, it's about adjusting your underwear and, it's about all these things that you don't necessarily want to do in public. And so the interface between the kind of squeamish personalness of bodily functions in public space. I mean, it's just a loaded space.
Yeah.
But I do think that that it's not just a kind of knee-jerk fear of trans people. I do think it's related to really deep political questions about who is recognized as a legitimate and accepted member of the body politic, and that it's not unrelated to questions of feminism and women being in public space. If you look at the history of this, it's where have the bathroom struggles been historically?
Oh, that's a
so,
great
so there
question. Yeah.
there were not public toilets before the 1870s, and it really had to do with the entry of women into the paid workforce, and getting out of that sort of cult of domesticity.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
the public sphere is the man's sphere, and the domestic sphere is the woman's sphere. So as you have more women in public and more women who are employed, then you have this need to accommodate those bodies.
Right,
and so
right.
which body will be accommodated? It's like,
Yeah,
is the female
exactly.
body accommodated in public space? Then you have the history of racial segregation. It's like, are people who are not white,
Right, which bathrooms
are
could you
people
use?
who have an African American ancestry? It's like, are they allowed to be in public space, or are they in a segregated, minoritized space? Look at the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. It's like, are people who have different forms of embodiment accommodated in public space?
Right, right.
What are the other moral panics about bathrooms and showers and locker rooms? It's mostly about gay men. It's like particularly at the height of the AIDS epidemic. So there is this long history of finding some kind of demonized, monsterized body that is different from norms, that gets mobilized
And you're right. It's like
against.
about purity and cleanliness.
Totally, right.
And,
Totally.
And you're right. When you bring it up, it's like there's a history of how we handled public bathrooms.
Right, and so I do see, I think this whole transgender bathroom thing is just like, it's so stupid,
know,
it's
it's
just
just-
so stupid,
that's
and
it.
yet it's
Right.
not stupid, because
'cause
it
it-
really is about which bodies will be accommodated in the public sphere, what kinds of difference from norms are accepted and
Right.
tolerated, not even just sort of celebrated, but it's like, people are different, which kinds of different people get to go pee in public.
Right,
That's really it in a nutshell.
Yeah, it sums it all up. So the new presidential administration, I wonder if you can give your thoughts on just what that means for trans people.
Can I have a drink?
You can also, I forgot to tell you, I should have said it before when you first got here, you can always take a pass and just say, we've had enough of that, let's just
Yeah.
skip on to the next thing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really disturbing. That's, I don't know what more to say. The November, December, January were really hard months. Because we are at a time where, there was, I'll just use the word progress, over the last decade on trans issues. And that, we're seeing that rolled back. And I try to think of other historical moments where civil rights are actually existing civil rights are being stripped away from people.
Right.
And that, there was, in the early 1970s, sort of after the first flush of sort of gay liberation, there was a pushback, the whole Anita Bryant Save Our Children campaign, where there were places where there had been local ordinances, or even at state level, creating sexual orientation as a protected class that were rolled back, and then they weren't, reestablished until the 90s, sometime. You think about the Japanese internment, like people who were U.S. citizens who their ability to freely control their own movements and own property and are stripped from them. You think about Reconstruction after the Civil War, so that we fight this Civil War. There's this period of radical Reconstruction where formerly enslaved African Americans are moving into government, and government services are available to them. They passed the 14th Amendment, and within a decade, by 1876, it's like the Northern Republicans have abandoned the Southern blacks, the Southern whites, retake control of the government and institute Jim Crow, to the point that Woodrow Wilson, then in 1914, resegregates the civil service, And so there have been these moments where, in the United States, people who have rights have been stripped of rights. So when I think, how do I as a trans person, how do I orient myself to this moment?
Yeah, you're
it's
vulnerable. You're in a different way than you were 6 months ago.
Yeah. I think back on the history of other minoritized peoples who, it's like, well, they have persisted, they have survived, like I love that Audre Lorde quote where she says, we were never meant to survive, but here we are, but we're here.
Right.
And so I think about, I try to take inspiration from Native Americans. It's like 400 years of occupation,
Right.
and yet there are vibrant indigenous communities. It's like, how do you live under occupation?
Right.
I think about African American history. Just how do you, how do you, you've survived slavery, you built, community, in the face of, racism.
Right.
How do you live that? It's just so my questions for how to live a trans life now in the face of this really remarkable onslaught, where we've kind of become, punching bags in the culture war, is to draw inspiration from people who have been engaged in much longer and deeper historical struggles on very similar kinds of issues.
Yeah, that's great, and I think everybody's looking for signs of hope, and that's just a great message to communicate to people that there is a kind of resilience in the face of terrible oppression. That we see.
I know older trans people, both because I'm an older trans person and I'm a historian, and
You're a middle-aged trans person.
That's true. That's true. I'm older than some.
Older than some, exactly.
But it's I have seen among the 20-something trans people that I know a lot of freak out.
yeah.
I mean, understandably so, about what's happening now, because they've kind of come to political consciousness in the Obama years, where it's you could make a credible case for a progress narrative. On these issues.
Well, as you say, you have decades where you make progress, and
some where you don't, and so there's this people are rushing to get name change documents put through or get approved for medical treatment while we still have medical care. Although right on Friday we stopped them in their tracks. So a lot of freak out, and then I hear older than me trans people talk about saying remember, it's we've been criminalized, we've been psychiatrized. It's we are people who have had no rights. It's we know how to live with no rights. We survived. Being able to it's you say you're trans, and it's people can take your kids away from you. They can refuse you a place to live. They can refuse you a job.
Put you in prison.
They can put you in, your very being is criminalized.
Yeah.
And so, and that was also my generational experience. I came out in the early 90s as trans, changed social genders. And, it was still that way.
Yeah.
And so knowing how to live as a person who has zero level of social support, and that you really do have to live by your wits and build a supportive community around you, know who's got your back, who doesn't.
Well, in a way, that's part of the advantage of being in a time where things have changed so quickly. You have people who you say, the younger people who have had the experience of growing up in Obama's America, and then you have the people who are older than you who've had experienced terrible, and it's all been so compressed because things have changed and happened so quickly. One of the things you write in your book is about just how the trans community relates to other communities, like the women's movement, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about. In the book you talk about both moments where the movements were kind of working in concert, and then moments when different individuals and different groups were a little bit more at odds. I wonder if you can talk about where we were and where we're going in terms of women's issues.
Sure. I guess the first thing I would point out is that you think about the prefix trans, with the hyphen. It's it means across, right? And so transness cuts across all the other categories.
And that was a great thing for your book too.
Right?
But like I said, it's one of those parts of that matrix.
Right. And so, but it's also something that moves through. If you think about the matrix as kind of a gridding of something, it's the being trans like cuts across everything. It's like it's not just like its own peg in its own slot.
and
It's
it's
about
not something that's it's not the same thing as it's a kind and it takes up the other differences within
right,
itself.
and moves across them, moves
Yeah.
across race, across gender categories, across class. It's like it's about a movement across categories, and so that can feel destabilizing to a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's that monster bit about it's about like, oh, things are sort of being ruptured or coming unbounded somehow, and that can feel very unsettling to other people.
Right,
To
right.
even just sort of be in the to confront what transness represents. So anyway, I wanted to say that because it's like, well, I can't really talk about the trans movement and the women's movement because the boundaries are blurry.
Right,
Transness cuts across everything.
Right,
And
right.
so, there are trans feminists and trans people who are not feminists. There are trans people who are women and trans people who aren't women. It's like, it's just irreducibly complicated.
Right. But given all that,
Given all that, feminism and the women's movement in the United States has been it's very heterogeneous, and that, like one of the places that I go to a lot, there was the Combahee River Collective statements,
Yeah,
the
right.
early 1970s from a collective of African American feminists. And one of the things that they were pointing out in that statement was saying, like, ideas about purity and separation like never
Right.
serve us, and like they were not separatist feminists because they were saying we just can't believe that woman is the only
Right.
category that can serve to oppress us.
Yeah.
We have to talk about race, we have to talk about the intersection of racially based forms of oppression and gender-based forms of oppression. And they basically just said we're very suspect of any biologically determinist
Right,
version
right.
of liberation.
Yeah.
And so it's not our biological womanness that is the guarantor of our feminist purity.
Right.
And we can't hate men because they're biologically male. We have to be opposed to misogyny and sort of andro supremacy and so like for
right.
me it's like that's this way of saying like it's like feminism is not about.
And that's what now, I'm trying to remember what's behind this question. Part of it was trans women who were excluded from all women gatherings is a theme of what. And you're right. That was that moment when you see that excluding somebody isn't necessarily the way to define what it is that you stand for as a group.
Yeah.
And you're right. That was that moment when women of color helped other women to reframe those issues. So
Right.
So womanhood wasn't about just kind of drawing the fences around and saying we are the women and.
Yeah, right. And so what I would just really want to insist on is that there have always been feminists who are very like trans affirming, or to be like talk in a more jargony way. There are cisgender, that is like
Right.
people who don't change sex.
Right.
Right. Cisgender, which is say the dominant, most common way of being a person.
Yeah.
Right. So there's cisgender feminists who have not been trans exclusive or hostile to trans people, and that has been true of feminism from the word go.
Yeah.
And there have been cisgender feminists who have been incredibly hostile to transgender people, like creating, the sort of the figure of a transgender monster or infiltrator. Like there's a lot of rhetoric of, these are the wolf in sheep clothing that are like trying to get into our, private protected spaces and wreak havoc, and this is the enemy, and this is what we have to guard against, and it's just like, there is an ideological spectrum within feminism, and it's like, so I don't want to mischaracterize feminism as hostile to trans issues.
Oh, completely, and
right?
that's not what I was trying to
right.
get at.
But there is definitely this minority of trans women. I mean, of feminists who do not like trans women. It's like it's a kind of, just a kind of bigotry. It's like anybody who singles out some other minority and thinks that they are the enemy that needs to be destroyed or eliminated
right.
somehow. And I just encourage people to go, Google, like trans feminism or trans exclusive radical feminism, and just see the level of vitriol that is there. It's like people who it doesn't get pointed at don't see it or don't really believe that it happens. But there's stuff that comes out of some quarters of feminism that's like every bit as pernicious as stuff that comes out of the KKK about black people and Jews. I mean, it's even some of the same language. There's a kind of I think a really irrational, fear-based hate. It's just like, and I don't want to pull any punches on that. But I don't see that as
right, exactly. But that's just what I was getting at. I mean, that story too of just what it means to be part of these movements is changing so much over time, and there is a chance to have a kind of more inclusive vision of things, which is, in a way it's part of the story of the book too. There's so many amazing figures in your book, and I wonder if you can just talk about just some of your heroes. When you think back at the people you've studied, these amazing individuals in history, who stands out as inspirational figures for you?
I feel like I'm inspired by anybody who figures out a way to live as trans and to be positive about their life and to just own it and celebrate it and think that it's a valuable way of being in the world. But as you mentioned, there's a lot of really colorful characters who I've come across. And maybe I think one of the most influential was this guy named Reed Erickson.
Oh, yeah,
you remember him?
Right, I totally do.
He was born into a kind of a left-wing entrepreneurial industrialist family. His father had this business smelting lead. He would buy used car batteries, extract the lead from it, and then sell the lead as an additive to the petroleum
Gasoline,
industry.
exactly.
Right? But he was totally left-wing, they ran in socialist and communist circles. They actually, Reed Erickson's father sold the family yacht to Fidel Castro.
Right,
and
right,
that it was the grandma that was the name of the yacht that Castro sails from Mexico to Cuba with all of his revolutionaries to launch the revolution on this boat that he buys from Reed Erickson's father. Erickson became the first, assigned female at birth, raised as a girl, became the first person who was female and living as a woman to get a master's degree in engineering from Louisiana State University.
Yeah.
They were there for the petroleum industry. He inherits his father's businesses in the early 1960s and is a millionaire. And he basically says, all right, here we go. I'm going to change the world on trans issues. And he funds all of the medical researchers.
Right, here in San Francisco.
He funds social
and that's part
services.
of the reason why there were so many universities that had transgender.
Right. So in the early 60s, he's funding the doctors, funding the research institutes, funding the social service stuff. And he basically funds the establishment of transgender health care as we know it.
Right. And working with the police in the Tenderloin and
so really fascinating. But then quite apart from, or maybe not apart from it, but in addition to that, he was interested in all kinds of things. He was a nudist. He owned a nudist camp. He funded research in human dolphin communication.
Oh, yeah, interspecies communication. You said that, and I'm I'm always communicating with other species.
Right.
I didn't realize that he was.
He's the person who funded publication of A Course in Miracles. He was interested in ESP and telepathy. He funded a lot of LSD research. He was just, he was one of these real outside-the-box kinds of people. And he had the money to pursue his interests. So, Yeah, I think he's a fascinating character.
Yeah, he was such a fascinating character, and you're right. It shows one person can just make such a big difference.
And a lot of dollars. One person and a lot of dollars can make a big difference.
I think that's true too. But I think you've made a difference like that too. I mean, it's just not just about the dollars. It's like who you bring when you're you, and you make a big difference. And you can make a big difference in one person's life.
No, I totally agree. I mean, like I think about Sylvia Rivera and Marsha Johnson, who were like trans women of color living on the streets in New York, who they were very outspoken in political ways. They helped the young kids who were coming up find a way to survive, and they were totally fierce in their politics. I love the organization they founded. It's got the best acronym ever, STAR. Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries.
Yes.
And they were, it's like they had nothing in terms of financial resources, but they had a vision, they had a fierceness, and, that was, early 70s, so, that was, 40, 45 years ago. People are still talking about them.
Yeah,
they made their mark.
Caitlyn Jenner and Chelsea Manning have been so much in the news, and I wonder what their impact on just public perceptions about transgender people are. I don't. Maybe it's too close for us to really understand what the meaning of their public statements have been. But
well, the Caitlyn Jenner thing, in terms of impact. GLAAD, Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, sort of the media watchdog group, they had done a survey, and before the Caitlyn Jenner moment a couple of years ago, 8% of the U.S. population said that they personally knew a transgender person. After the Caitlyn Jenner moment, within a year, 16%. So that's still a minority, but a huge impact.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think that when we know us, we feel like we know celebrities as if they're. I mean, maybe that's why Donald Trump got elected. I mean, it's like electing your uncle or something. He's been in my living room so many times. Now I'm going to vote for him.
Yeah,
but that's strange. So I mean, because I can't believe that many people suddenly went out and started meeting transgender people.
Yeah. Well, I think transgender people are always present. We're always here.
Yeah.
But I think people are trained to not look at us and notice this may be too long an extended metaphor, but there's this book that I love by the author China Miéville called The City and the City, which is, I just check out the book. I highly recommend it. It's not about trans anything, but it's about these two cities that are right next to each other, and they in fact overlap with each other. They share some territory, and they're totally hostile to each other. And so people who live in what they call the cross-hatched areas, where you're actually sharing space.
It's like a Venn diagram.
Right, where you're sharing space with people from the other city. People train themselves to not see people from the other city. They have different traffic rules, and so it's like they drive on different sides of the street. And so how do you dodge those cars? Right. But that sort of metaphor of how you train yourself to not see what you have to pay attention to, anyway. Yeah. It's but you ignore. I mean, it's like the way we deal with homeless people. It's you see homeless people all the time, right? But you just walk around. You see, trans people are around all the time, but people act like they don't know about it. They act like they've never heard of it.
That's such an interesting phenomenon.
And so I do think that when the kind of in the glare of, sort of media spotlight around Caitlyn Jenner, there are, trans people are going I've been here all along, and somebody will finally say, it's oh yeah, well, my first cousin, changed sex. I don't really talk about that. And it's just it's kind of stirred the pot a little bit. Yeah. And something that was already present sort of becomes attended to and paid attention to in a different way. So, I wish Caitlyn Jenner were a better spokesperson for all of the community.
What advice would you have to give her? I mean, she could.
I would say be quiet and listen, and don't feel like you have to be the one to talk. That's a good way to start.
That's good advice for almost everybody starting any new thing.
Yeah.
Be quiet and listen.
One of the other findings in these two big national surveys that have been done is that looking at political affiliation of transgender people, 50% identify as Democrat, 48% as independent, and 2% as Republican. Okay, and so
that's
you know,
amazing.
and that's looking at a sample size of about 27,000 people.
Wow,
so I mean, that's pretty good
extraordinary.
sample size.
That's an extraordinary statistic.
Yeah. So yeah, Caitlyn Jenner is just like, it's like I wish her well, like as
Yeah.
an individual, and everybody deserves happiness and peace in their own skin, but it's like just like shut up, really.
Well, I mean, heck, that's the advice I'm trying to follow the whole time I've been talking to you is listen first, because we have so much to learn from. Chelsea Manning, how is that case different? And,
I'm quite fascinated with Chelsea Manning and really supportive of her, of her situation. I mean, I think she's a person of incredible integrity and courage, that she's basically been in solitary confinement, and that's a horrible thing to do to anybody.
Yeah.
I have not met her, so it's like I hesitate to say too much, but I read a lot of what she writes.
Yeah.
And she's characterized in the press as this kind of disturbed, traitorous, psychopath, and it's you can agree or disagree with what she did in terms of being a whistleblower, but I think she was very well motivated by what she did. It's like she was a younger person who was like not totally, I would say like not fully politically conscious, who finds herself in the military for a variety of reasons and is just appalled by what she's confronted with. And her whistleblowing, it came out of a pacifist place. It came out of notions of like transparency in government. It came out of this real sense of doing what was morally right, what was right in front of her to do. And it's like, yeah, she had some challenges. She was in a tough period of life, and it's impossible, I think, to separate out her political convictions and sense of what was morally right from the kind of distress and crisis that she was in when she chose to act. But, basically, she's a political prisoner who's transgender, who they just threw the book at her.
Yeah.
Like that other people who have done similar kinds of things, in terms of whistleblowing, where they have broken some existing law. It's like their prison sentences have been like like in the 3 to 5 year range, and that they give Manning like a 30 plus year sentence. It was like it was cruel and unusual punishment.
Yeah.
And so, I have been part of the, efforts to support her in prison, and I was very pleased that one of Obama's last acts was to, sort of commute her sentence to time served.
Yeah.
She's supposed to be out next month, I think.
Yeah.
I hope that happens with the regime change that we have experienced.
When you have someone like Caitlyn Jenner or Chelsea Manning, like who in the trans community is kind of like that wise elder who can kind of help them navigate stuff? Is it just a different?
Well, I think again, I haven't met Caitlyn personally, but I know a number of people who've been on her show, and I think part of the whole reality TV show format, the I Am Kate thing, was kind of you let Caitlyn Jenner play the naive, newcomer and kind of getting schooled by people who have been at the game longer than she has.
Right.
So, so there were plenty of people, telling Caitlyn Jenner what to do. That was part of the whole structure of the reality TV show. And with Chelsea Manning, it's like she has a really good legal team. That the ACLU was totally supporting her. There's a lawyer by the name of Chase Strangio, who's a trans guy who's a staff attorney at ACLU, and he's been, kind of the point person with them. So I do think Manning has a good support network in
that's
place.
good.
It'll be interesting to see, interesting, fragile, precarious,
Oh my
to
gosh,
see what
exactly
happens
what the
when she
future
gets out.
is.
Because people who have been, imprisoned and who have experienced
yeah.
that kind of, I would say abuse in the prison
Right,
system,
right.
it's like they have a lot of vulnerabilities when they're trying to reenter. Just a quick little shout out on that topic. Most of the trans people who are incarcerated are not white people. It's mostly people of color, mostly trans women of color,
Yeah.
who are imprisoned in men's prisons. They could, have no facial hair and breasts and long hair, still have a penis, and they go to a men's prison, and they are not safe in those
Yeah,
places.
right.
And so it's kind of ironic in some ways that like one of the poster children, of trans
Right,
incarceration
exactly,
issues is a white woman.
right,
That is
right.
not the typical
Yeah. So, I
situation.
mean, that seems like a really important part of just like trans activism now.
Yeah.
Is
Prison
is
abolitionism,
and-
support for people in prison, support for people who are out of prison. There's a great project here in San Francisco. It's called TGI Justice, Transgender, Gender Variant, and Intersex Justice. It's trans woman of color led. It is led by people who are formerly incarcerated, and it does support work for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated trans people.
maybe as we're starting to get closer to the end, that's why I'm starting to like pick things up. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about other areas that are important transgender advocacy issues. And while we're doing it, we're taking questions on little cards, and Rebecca has a few over there. So she'll, if you have questions that you would like to ask, just write them on the little card that's there at your table. But so prison advocacy, what are other major...
It's healthcare access.
Yeah.
It's security of employment. Because you can fire transgender people in many parts of the United States just for being trans. It's about basic accommodations in public service, or this way. Public accommodation is, often a problem. There's just, it's like, quick little story. One of the things that came out of San Francisco in the 1960s as part of the whole, sort of radical movement that was going on here was this unit of the public health department called the Center for Special Problems, right? It's
Yeah.
and it was like dealing with people who had multiple issues, but like listening to one of the directors talk about it in this interview that I found. He says, at the Center for Special Problems, we help people with the problems they encounter in the everyday course of living. So like the special needs that transgender people have, I would say is about like dealing with problems that come up in the everyday course of living. It's about like, where do I live? What do I eat? Are my family relationships secure?
Right.
It's like, am I documented? Can I say who I am and
Right,
prove it
exactly.
to people that matters to?
Yep, so that your picture matches the picture of the
Right.
center.
Right. And so, what are the areas of policy that trans people need to deal with? It's like life itself, in all of its fine-grained quotidian
Yeah,
detail. It's like, that's
exactly.
what we need to deal with.
Right. So I have a question that just came from our group. So could you talk a little bit about the Compton riots and your film?
Yeah. In 1966, August of 1966, here in San Francisco, at the corner of Turk and Taylor Streets.
I know, just down the
in
hill.
the Tenderloin.
Yeah, on the street.
Right. There was this all-night cafeteria called Compton's Cafeteria, that people who lived in the neighborhood would go to. There were a lot of, street kids who would go there. There were, the thing I should say about the neighborhood is that the Tenderloin functioned as a transgender ghetto. Literally a ghetto. That's like if trans people were found in other parts of the city, the police would bring them to the Tenderloin and say, this is where you're supposed to be. Some of the only places that would rent to transgender people were the SRO hotels down on, sort of around Turk and Taylor. With with trans women not being able to find other jobs and live anywhere else, a lot of people did survival prostitution, and they did it in the Tenderloin. And so, it was their neighborhood, and this place, Compton's, was, it was like their chill-out lounge. It was the neighborhood living room. It's like people would just go there and hang out because it was, cheap and well-lighted, and, you get a cup of coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs. And the police were constantly raiding the place and picking up trans people. And in August of 1966, for a variety of reasons, when the police came in to raid one night, they just said, nope, not this time, and they fought back. And so there was, an actual, they trashed the restaurant and broke out the windows and the police cars, and, were driving up and, with the wagons to take people away, and like they're burning the newsstand on the corner outside. It's like it was a riot, and that it really was, as far as I know, the first time in U.S. history that trans people militantly stood up, fought back against the structural violence that they were experiencing in ways that changed how society treated them. It's like in the aftermath of that riot, the way the city of San Francisco dealt with trans people changed. It's like able to get ID documents, able to get better health care, policing practices changed. So it's like it was a significant victory, I would say. And this is a story that I came across just doing research on San Francisco's LGBT history that nobody was really talking about when I found this document describing it, and I kind of made it my mission, I'm doing other things as well, but over the years in the 90s, I was always trying to track down pieces of information about this riot, and finally, by around 2000, I feel like I had the story pulled together. And a friend of mine and I made a documentary film about it called Screaming Queens, the Riot at Compton's Cafeteria.
You won a Lammy for it, though.
I won an Emmy for that.
Emmy for that.
Yeah.
That's great. I mean,
yeah, so it was...
and you still probably had people who had a
there were
memory
people
of it.
who were there who were able to tell their story on screen. And,
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
So we got a national broadcast on PBS, and over time, it has become this thing that is remembered. It's like, and that was really my goal. As a historian, an academically trained historian, you tend to think of history as something that other people do, and you study it and you teach it to other people.
Yeah.
And this sense of making history, not necessarily in the sense of you're the person with the red banner at the barricades, but making history in the sense of, I want to use my skills to have something be able to be remembered by others. It's like none of us were, at, Valley Forge, it's like, and yet we remember that it happened. Most of us were not at Stonewall, but we remember that it happened. It becomes part of cultural memory. And so my goal was really to insert into a broader cultural memory the knowledge that trans people don't, suffer in silence, right? That it's a politicized community. There are real issues that need to be dealt with, and that, we are empowered and we can stand up and we fight back.
One of the questions is related to that. Is what is your current academic work focused on, and what do you hope to accomplish as co-editor of TSQ? It says thank you, and has a little picture for you too.
Oh, thank you. That person is smiling. After, I transitioned in the early 90s, was largely unemployed as a result of that for a long time. But finally, after about 15 years of, kind of making my own fun and figuring out ways to get paid for things I was interested in, the Academy...
You worked for the Historical Society.
I used to be the executive director of the GLBT Historical Society, and I was a filmmaker.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
Wrote non-academic books. One of my co-authors is actually here today, Jim Van Buskirk. I did a book with him called Gay by the Bay. Anyway, so it's like, after a number of years of figuring out how to get paid for things that I was interested in doing, it said finally... the Academy valued some of the things that I did.
Yeah.
And, I've been, I would say, reasonably in demand as a professor and speaker and whatnot since then. But one of the things I've been really interested in doing in moving more into higher education is, it's about changing how we know about trans issues. It's just like we are the experts in our own lives.
Right.
And that's not just to say subjectively. It's like, I understand this subjectively, and therefore discount, more kind of empirical or objective ways of studying trans people.
Yeah.
But to just say, we are the experts in our own lives. We are in conversation with other people. Some of us have, formal training and, whether it's medicine or psychology or cultural studies, literature, whatever, and that we are a part of the conversation. Nothing about us without us.
Yeah. Religion's like that too. I mean,
Right.
so being a person who studies religion, you can do that from the standpoint of a person being a person of faith.
Yeah. So, so for me, there is a kind of intellectual activism that comes, that being part of the academy for me is not like, oh, now I can go retreat to the ivory tower and stroke my chin and think great thoughts. It's like, the cliche of the university is like, oh, it's the knowledge factory. But it is kind of the knowledge factory. It's like the university is where socially legitimated knowledge is produced.
Right.
And so like to bring people into that situation to make knowledge differently, I think is actually deeply political.
Yeah.
And that, I've worked on, developing curriculum. I've worked on getting trans people hired in the academy. I've worked on, building up, like this book. This is written as sort of an introductory textbook
like
on
me.
trans history. It's like it gets taught, in high schools and, at the undergraduate level.
Yeah.
All over the country. So it's like I've really, tried to do my part to, produce a different kind of trans knowledge.
Yeah.
A more kind of, it's like, no, like I am the expert, we are the experts. So this journal, TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly, is the first peer-reviewed journal. It's published by Duke University Press that takes a cultural studies approach to trans issues. My co-editor is this guy Paisley Curra, who's in political science at the Graduate College at City University of New York. Anyway, it's like we just thought, all right, what new tool can we add to the quiver here of this like trans knowledge production thing? Right, but it's like it's giving scholars who work in this field the opportunity to publish in a peer-reviewed journal so that goes on their CV so that they can
even just
get a job so they can...
to explore whether other people share their same interests. You can learn so much from publishing an article that you hear from other people who are doing... So it's big connections.
We put out about... Well, what would that be? It's like around 800 pages a year. It's about 200 pages an issue. They're about 187, 188 pages per issue. So, it's like, and we launched that in 2014, and since then, it's just like, we're building up a base, a scholarly base.
Yeah, filling up those library bookshelves.
Right.
So here's a question. Some cultures like Thailand, Indonesia don't seem to have transphobia. The Philippines, in particular, are a very family-oriented culture with many trans people and the acceptance of them. The USA is a very war-oriented culture, and there seems to be a pattern. Why do other cultures treat their trans people better, and does being family or war-oriented have anything to do with that? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's hard to compare what I think of as like Eurocentric, North American, Anglophone culture, that transgender identities, are sort of enmeshed in, with the ways that other parts of the world, or even other earlier historical periods, think about what we now call sex and gender and sexuality and identity. It's like it's just comparing apples and oranges, and so. It's hard to talk cross-culturally. But, I would push back a little bit in saying that other cultures treat transgender people better, because it can often be, it's like it's more accepted, it's more visible, but it's not necessarily more valued. One example that I give on that topic, in Nepal, they were one of the first countries to allow a third gender designation on state-issued IDs and passports. So you could be a man or a woman, or you could be tesaro lingi, like third gender. And you would think, wow, like Nepal, it's like, that's all that like Himalayan Buddhist spirituality or something, and they're recognizing, trans people as this other kind of being, and you're like, wow, how cool is that? But really, it was about the fact that trans people in Nepal could be, recognized as having some kind of like, spiritual significance, but that doesn't mean you want them to like have a job,
Right.
And so a lot of, third gender people in Nepal were unemployable. They might be like wholly unemployable, but
exactly.
wholly unemployable at the same time, right?
Good.
Right? And so where do they go to work? It's like a lot of Nepalese go work in the United Arab Emirates in the construction trade.
Right.
But then you run into problems there with like this strict gender segregation. It's like, oh, is this a man or a woman? What line do they get in? Where do they pray? Right? And so because of the way that in the Emirates, gender is organized, there's this economic need for the trans laborer from Nepal. So how do you do it? It's like, well, just like give them a T on their passport, and that way they're not a man or a woman, and we can exempt them from certain kinds of obligations or regulations. It has nothing to do with accepting trans people. It has everything to do with the transnational labor market. Right? So I'm just very cautious about romanticizing other cultures' acceptance of trans people, while at the same time finding it very valuable to say, it's like societies around the world and throughout time have organized what we call sex, gender, and identity very differently.
Yeah.
And, it's like...
That's important to be reminded of.
Yeah, different is not necessarily better, but it is different. Some things are better and some things aren't.
Yeah. Well, I've got to go because I've got to do church upstairs.
Okay.
But I'm so grateful for you for being here today. It's been such a blessing to, like I said, reading this book opened my eyes to so many things. I really, really appreciate your work and grateful that you came in.
I'm so glad you've been invited. Thank you.
Made it past all the marathoners.
Okay,
next week, Arlie Hawkshield will be here. So she's, does anybody know the name of her book? I'm reading it. It's got a white cover and a picture of a sugarcane mill on the front. But she's studied people in Louisiana to try to understand what people in the middle of the country are thinking. So what are the kinds of people who voted for Donald Trump? How are they feeling and where are they? So she'll be here next Sunday, and you're welcome to join us for the forum. And thank you again to Susan Stryker.
It's great to be here. Thank you all for coming.